look, there was great change, but it was necessary at the time. And some of the big names you bring in, even to this day, Tim, it just sometimes you're like, wow, I saw that player play in Toronto. Julio Cesar was the first one. I mean, bringing over a goalkeeper who was going to be playing in a home World Cup in the months following. I mean, that was a big acquisition. Then Defoe, when Bradley came along, I mean, you hit the ground running, Tim. Like, what do you remember about that time and kind of the big name hunting, but making sure that they're surrounded with a cast that could obviously also achieve success?
Yeah, what I remember about that time was thinking that I'm not going to last more than a month or two. Not
Really?
from, first, am I going to get fired? But two, just the sheer pace at which Tim Latwicki can work it's for a person of his age is incredible. I mean, he all hours calling and we're creating plans because we needed to turn over the roster with Ryan Nelson and Ryan, to his credit, was working extremely hard. He was really well connected, and that was an example where the three of us were really complementary because Tim was a big thinker and really supported us to shoot for the moon. Ryan obviously was well connected, and then I was sort of the person at that time who was in charge of sort of making sure it all worked from mechanics, from the contract standpoint, from the league rules. And so the three of us, we went on this mission and these trips over to Europe, where we met, Frank Lampard and the Defoes and the Bianchis and various players that we were looking for to fill that number 9 role, or we were actually looking for two strikers at the time. What I remember about that time was how quickly we were moving. It was such a fast pace, and we needed to get all our ducks in a row and create strong pitches, right, to attract the talent to the market. But I also remember how something had changed too in the world market, where people, especially in a city like Toronto, were recognizing him less, starting to recognize him less, and they would be. Whereas before, when I was at the league office, I would say once every few months, someone would call, an agent from a player who was in his 30s would call, being interested in the league. Whereas I feel like once I moved to Toronto, we were on our pitches. You could set up a meeting with any agent, any player. I don't care who they were; they would at least listen. Especially when you had someone like Tim Latwicki, who everyone knew had brought David Beckham over to Major League Soccer.
Right.
And so that was massive. That was massive.
Well, what's incredible is it was dubbed the bloody big deal at the time. Defoe and Bradley came over, but it's actually what Defoe turned into that's actually probably more complicated, and which inevitably brought the team that MLS Cup. Doing a swap deal, player for player, essentially, there might be more to it, Tim, but Altidore for Defoe, I mean, that's something that you just don't see in the game today, typically player swaps. Just how complicated is making a deal like that, and how convinced were you that you were doing the right thing at that time?
I think we knew we were doing the right thing because we knew the player wanted out, right? And he had expressed an interest even earlier in the summer, and we felt like we were in a position maybe still to make the playoffs at that point in 14 to do it. And so we wanted to hold tight. Plus, we had invested quite a bit, right, in Defoe. So at that point, we felt like, let's give it a chance. We had just recently we had switched coaches at that time, and so we wanted Greg to have the opportunity to see what we could do with Jermain. But just to go back, the bloody big deal was still to this day one of the most remarkable marketing campaigns I've ever seen or been a part of. I mean, the big red bus, we flew over to London to tape parts of that. Shannon Hosford and David Freeman at MLSE deserve all the plaudits for this incredible campaign. But as one board member, it became, the bloody big mess is unfortunately what it turned out to be. But we learned so much from that, and so I will never look back and say it was a mistake. I think that's the lesson in football, is that you're never going to get them all right, no matter how good the player is. But the one thing I learned is that the player has to really desire to be a part of that club and in that city. You can't oversell a project to him. You can't, at some level, you have to meet 50-50 at midway, or maybe not midway, even 75-25, and say, hey, this is as far as we can go. You need to do the heavy lifting in this way, or else this isn't going to work. And you got to give it to him straight. right up front at the beginning and show them how hard and tell them how hard it's going to be, the travel, the lifestyle. It's just different. So, and then to your point about flipping it for Defoe, I mean, for Altidore, for Jozy, that extremely complicated. We were able to utilize the league office quite a bit in that, because Jozy is supposed to come in through the allocation ranking system. But there were two clubs who felt it was a win-win for both of them, and the players were both in a position where they wanted to leave. And so, fortunately, in the footballing world, there's always players who are unhappy with their situation. That's inevitable, and and so when that situation exists, then the question is, can you establish trust between the front offices and the ownership groups where you feel like you can get a deal done? And I feel like that was, again, where we relied on the agents and the league office, and we got on the phone and worked out a deal to do it right. And luckily we were able to get it over the line.
Very well, and it was a club transformation that really came out of that move and where it led. You're a pro, Tim, because you're asking questions. Mike was wondering, what did you learn from the Defoe situation? You explained it perfectly right there, which you probably apply now, because now being in Columbus, you're dealing with a different set of circumstances. You kind of talked about it. They're different markets, different places. So do you use that technique? How much do you use that technique in your pursuit of players? Because you're not pitching Toronto, you're pitching Columbus, which are different in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly take pieces of it. I mean, what I learned during this first few years and the mistakes that we made, and then how we made up for them with Jozy and Giovinco, and obviously Michael coming in, is provided a playbook or a blueprint that I use to this day. There's a lot of the things that I learned at that time that I use for every single one of my signings, and certainly even Giovinco was one where sort of had to learn and do it with our group that we and the soccer operations staff, without Tim, or at that time, obviously we had switched coaches, but it was our group that was able to go and do that. And so we had to take what we learned from the first signings to go and apply that to acquire Giovinco. And then now in Columbus, you're right, we're in a different situation, but I think the same rules still apply, but we also have to understand the values of this market, and they're going to be different than the values of not just the fans, but the city as a whole, and what types of players will resonate for this coach and for this system and in this market. But a lot of the mechanics are the same. The timelines are the same in terms of how you approach windows and the recruitment timelines and the need to do the dirty work 6, 12, 18 months in advance. And then the same that mistake for Defoe, the lesson learned still applies, which is we need people who want to be here and want to be in Columbus for what Columbus is. And so it's a little bit more of a challenge, because we have to educate more people on who Columbus is and what we're about here. Not just the club, but the city, because it's not as well known as Toronto. That's just a fact. But we have to be aware of that fact. That's our situation. And turn it into a strength. And what we find is once people actually learn about Columbus and dig in deeper, they fall in love with it. And what you find is a lot of our former players in Columbus always try to come back and play for the Crew. It's amazing how many people, once I became president GM here, how many former players either want to work or move their family back here because they love this club. And obviously there are 20 years of history here, because we're the first club in Major League Soccer. So there's a lot more of those players than in Toronto, right? Sure. When I came in 2013, the club had only been around for 7-8 years. And so there wasn't this affinity from all the past alumni like there is in Columbus, where you have an alumni event, you're having hundreds of players coming back.